Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by nailib.com. We are looking at some of the most important features of our exploration in paper 2, wherein we are going to talk about authoritarian leaders who occupied the world as far as the 20th century is concerned. Amongst these, we are going to do almost 8 case studies, important case studies, and we are also going to look at some of the comparative lenses. However, we must start those case studies somewhere, and in that context, let's start from the very beginning and cover our first case study, which deals with Joseph Stalin in the USSR. As most of you might be aware, Joseph Stalin was the leader who took over the USSR after the death of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and he ruled the USSR until his death in 1950s. So in that sense, it's very important to think of him as an important leader of the 20th century, especially during the Second World War. We are going to cover a lot of important periods and time periods, most important events as far as he's concerned. And we'll also be looking at some of the key takeaways as far as the syllabus offering is concerned in terms of policies and foreign policies and domestic issues, etc. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into our exploration of Joseph Stalin and the USSR under him between 1924 and 1953, which is his death in March of 1953. Joseph Stalin emerged victorious from the power struggle that followed the death of Lenin in 1924, the creator of the USSR. Having taken control of the party by late 1920, somewhere around 28-29, Stalin over the next quarter of a century used the most ruthless means to impose himself on all aspects of Soviet life. He revolutionized the economy by enforced policies of collectivization and industrialization. These are some of the things that we'll be studying in greater detail, and destroyed political opposition with a series of ferocious purges. Purges is cleansing. Purges is killing people in very, very large numbers, and that's the adjective that is being used for the purges here, which is ferocious. So the number of people who were killed was way huge in like the total number of strength, etc. Such was the extent of his authority that by the time of his death in 1953, Soviet communism had become, in fact, Stalinism. So people have in fact studied, scholars like Stephen Kotkin have studied the idea of Stalinism as a civilization. So they have looked at how Stalinism goes ahead and occupies every aspect of one's life, an individual's life, and that is why looking at Stalinism becoming almost synonymous with Soviet communism and a way of life as well. So in this particular exploration, we will examine the following. We will look at what circumstances favored the rise of Stalin. We would look at how did Stalin impose his authority on the Soviet Union. We would look at what impact did Stalinism have on the lives of the Soviet people. And of course, we will look at how far did Stalin achieve the totalitarian state. You would remember obviously from the last few videos that totalitarianism and authoritarianism are merely separated by a question of degree. Totalitarianism is a much higher control of an individual's life than authoritarianism, and that's why what ends up happening is the achievement of Stalin, of the totalitarian state by Stalin. So his rise to power then between 1924 and 1929, there was a one-party state in the USSR. Having taken over the power in October of 1917, Lenin had led his Bolshevik party in laying the foundations of the world's first Marxist state. So that's the credit that is to given to USSR, that it's the world's first Marxist state. What do we mean by Marxist state? Basically a state that has come into reality on the views and vision of someone called Karl Marx. So he had understood, he had described a certain kind of statehood that shall be achieved, and that comes into being because of his ideas, and that's why it's the first Marxist state. The Bolsheviks claimed that their triumph gave them an absolute right to govern Russia. There was a powerful ideology underlying this assumption. As Marxists, the Bolshevik believed that they truly represented the will of the Russian proletariat, simply means the working class. So they truly represented the views of the Russian proletariat, who now ruled in accordance with the scientific laws of the dialectic. So Marxist dialectic, Marx's way of understanding the world, the dynamic force that drives history along a predestined path. So that is the meaning of dialectic, that history has a predetermined path. History will do what it thinks of doing. So history has its own predetermined path, and all the factors that play around that are called the dialectic. So that's a technical term. You may just want to use it in your answer, but you don't have to really espouse on it or write about it at length. And all this is happening in terms of a scientific understanding of the past. So that is also something that is very important. The Bolshevik consolidation of power then. By the time of Lenin's death in 1924, the Bolsheviks had overcome all the major challenges to their authority and had transformed Russia into the USSR. This involved their fighting and winning a desperate civil war, successfully resisting a series of foreign interventions, and surviving a series of severe economic crises. So this is like followed by one after the other. This is a very important time period where back-to-back challenges are being offered to the Soviet state, and they still continue to survive from those challenges, and some of these challenges are in fact international in nature. The consolidation of the Bolshevik power was a remarkable achievement, but it was gained obviously by the most violent means. It was not something that was built on the ideas of peace as Marx had thought in large part that it will happen by peace, but clearly it didn't happen by peace in a very large part. For the most part, it was a very violent transformation. Lenin had allowed no opposition to his government, political enemies had been crushed, and critics within the party were suppressed. Lenin's years in power left the Soviet Union with a tradition of authoritarian rule and terror. That's an important point that very few scholars, in fact, make. Most of them blame Stalin for starting the entire, idea and tradition of terror and authoritarianism. They forget to, and they mostly ignore that the origins of that authoritarian state and the origins of that terror, in fact, lies with the state, the kind of state envisaged and put into action by Vladimir Lenin much more than what Stalin does later on. Stalin merely exploits that entire presence, and Stalin merely takes it to the next degree perhaps of authoritarian rule, turning it into a totalitarian rule. But in terms of terror, in terms of the mechanisms of authoritarianism, Vladimir Lenin very much was a part of the origin story. There were also serious economic problems that had still to be solved if the USSR was to survive as a nation when Lenin dies in 1924. I just want to give you the name of a historian who is in fact talking about all of this. His name is Robert Gelatli, and you might benefit from his work, which looks at Hitler, Stalin, Lenin. The book is called An Age, and in that catastrophe, he is identifying these three individuals. Government structures then. What about the government structures in Soviet Union? How do they, if at all, encourage this kind of a, like a proper authoritarian system, or were there government structures which were there in place to oppose it? Let's see that. By 1924, the governmental structure of the Soviet Union had developed two main features. There was the Council of the People's Commissars and there was the Secretariat. So the Council of the People's Commissars, commissar is merely the word for a minister. That's the new word that they have invented. The Soviet lexicon or the Soviet vocabulary has come up with this new word for minister, because the word minister is associated too much with the Tsarist regime. Therefore, they do away with the word minister and they instead come up with the term of commissar. So if you look at it, Council of the People's Commissar simply means the cabinet. So there's a leader and he has a bunch of ministers. That council of ministers is the cabinet. So in that sense, it's just a council of ministers. And the second, of course, is the secretariat, where all the paperwork is done. So the bureaucracy, that is also need to be kept in control. Both these bodies and various committees they established were staffed and controlled by the Bolshevik party under Lenin. So all of this was in fact being controlled by, all of it was like both of these together were controlled by Lenin with his iron grip. It has to be stressed that the vital characteristic of this governmental system was that the party ruled. So everything, like you could be whoever you wanted to be, you could be a minister or you could be a bureaucrat, you had to be affiliated with the Communist Party. In other words, the state was the party was the state. Alright, there was no existence in terms of the executive, legislative and judicial functions of the state. There was no existence of these functions if you were not a part of the party. So you had to be a member of the Communist Party at this point of time. In fact, this in effect meant that Lenin ruled, since his moral authority and standing in the party was so strong that he was unchallengeable. So basically Lenin is ruling, but in the name of the party. He is not declaring himself to be a dictator. He is not declaring himself to be a sole leader. Everything he does, he has to justify it with the mechanisms of the party. In practical terms, however, the key organization was the Politburo, which is the highest decision-making body in the Communist Party. By 1922, the Soviet Union was a one-party Leninist state. Membership of that one party was essential to all those who held governmental posts at whatever level. So regardless of the level, nobody cared at what level you were. You could be the lowest of the employees or you could be the highest of the employees. You had to be a member of the party. You had to show loyalty to the party. Politburo is an inner core of some 20 leading members of the Communist Party. The numbers kept changing depending on who got purged by Stalin at what stage. So the numbers kept changing, but around number like 20 was the number of the maximum number of members who occupied the Politburo at a given point of time. So then there is, of course, the question of democratic centralism. That's another key theme as far as Soviet politics under Lenin is concerned. A central feature of Lenin's control of the Communist Party was the principle of democratic centralism. Now, we have done at length, if you look at some of our previous videos, we have discussed this term of democracy at length. So if the Soviet Union is using the term democracy, please don't be very surprised by it, because they obviously have a very different meaning of it rather than what you would immediately understand. So let's see, what do they mean by democratic centralism. It simply means, it was the notion as developed by Lenin. So this is Lenin's definition, okay? This is not like a textbook definition. According to Lenin, it simply meant that true democracy in the Bolshevik party lay in the obedience of the members to the authority and the instructions of the leaders. So the party had democratic centralism, which meant that everybody within the party followed the instructions of the leader, and that is called democratic centralism. So everything is centralized in the hands of the leader, and that is something that is to be kept in mind when you are following instructions and when you are being given instructions. The justification for this, how can you call it democracy? I mean, democracy is the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. So why are you calling it a democracy? So the justification for this was that while a representative of the workers, all Bolsheviks were genuine revolutionaries, only the leaders were sufficiently educated in science of revolution to understand what needed to be done. So at this stage, democratic centralism was very necessary when it was the leaders who were the vanguard of the revolution. While every Bolshevik is a revolutionary because he or she is a member of the party, the true revolutionaries who can guide others into the art of revolution, if you will, or the science of revolution, if you will, in that sense, it is very, very important to think of them as the true vanguards, and therefore you have to follow them, you have to follow their instructions, and therefore the principle of democratic centralism. In practice, I mean, this was the principle that, leaders will lead. But in practice, democratic centralism simply meant that the Bolsheviks were going to do whatever Lenin told them to do. It's not so much all leaders who are well versed in the science and art of revolution. It's only Vladimir Ilyich Lenin who needs to be understood and who needs to be followed as a true marker, as a true beacon of not only Leninism but Soviet revolution. And it was the principle which Stalin then was to inherit and then, of course, exploit for his own leadership in Soviet Russia. So then the coming of the authoritarian rule, Lenin created an authoritarian system which returned Russia to the absolutism that it had once known under its czars. The basic apparatus of oppression for which Stalin later became notorious for using was in place by the time of Lenin's death. So the apparatus was very much in place, the structure was very much in place, the kind of, the important parameters were very much in place. Stalin only becomes notorious for exploiting them to their fullest extent. The main features then of Lenin's authoritarian rule between 1917 and 1924 were the following. Number one, of course, one party state. All parties are dissolved, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, apart from that, all other parties were outlawed. So there's no space for opposition. That's the first feature of a state. The second feature of a state, it's a bureaucratic state. Central power increased under Lenin and the number of government departments and officials grew. So there was a lot of paperwork that is being churned out at this point. The police state, so the Cheka was the first in a series of secret police organizations in the Soviet Union, whose task was in fact to impose the government control of the people. So Cheka is the creation of a new secret police, and yeah, it's right that it keeps changing. In fact, later on it became the OGPU, and today we know the Cheka as the ill-famous KGB. Alright, so just like whenever you think of the US, you think of the secret organization called CIA. Similarly, you think of the KGB whenever you think of modern day Russia. The origins of that lie in the secret police force called the Cheka that had been started under Vladimir Lenin. Then, of course, even within the party, number one, all opposition parties are outlawed. In the party itself, if you want to have opposition, sorry, you cannot, because there's a ban on factionalism. So you cannot criticize the leadership within the party, and therefore there was a ban on free speech. Then, of course, there was a complete destruction of trade unions. Along with Trotsky, they destroyed the independence of trade unions. So you had to listen to the party as far as even trading rights are concerned. The politicizing of the law. So under Lenin, the law was not a means of protecting society, but in fact an extension of political control. So creating laws by which you could control more and more people. The system of purges and show trials, outstanding examples of these were the public trials in 1922 of the Moscow clergy and of the social revolutionaries, the SRs. So they had been in fact purged and they had been put on show trials even during the time of Lenin. And of course, Stalin is going to take this to the absolutely next level, and there are going to be purges of a very huge number of people. And of course, in great numbers, the show trial will happen under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. Of course, we see the beginning of the concentration camps. At the time of Lenin's death, there were already over 300 such camps. They were used to hold rebel peasants and anti-Bolsheviks. So anybody who criticized, you could be sent to the concentration camp. Basically, a place where you do public work without any money, and of course, you are also tortured and you are punished in various ways for having the temerity to question the authoritarian state of the Soviet Union. Then there was, of course, prohibition of public worship. So Orthodox Christian churches were looted and then closed. Atheism was adopted as a replacement for religious belief. There was clearly an understanding of nationalization, where you take over the private companies and banks. There were also, of course, imposed economic policies faced with famine. Lenin had tried a series of experiments ranging from fierce repression of the peasants under something called war communism, and then, of course, a more lenient approach called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Lenin claimed that NEP was a temporary measure, but it was still in operation by the time of his death. Then there was another thing that is again a very, very famous measure of multiple communist states, most famously under Mao Zedong in China, which is the question of the Cultural Revolution. So the Bolsheviks claimed that in the inter-revolutionary Russia, the people were now ready to be molded into a new species. So a more high-evolved version of the kind of man that you were. So man can now be made whatever we want him to be, and culture was to be shaped by the power of the state. So this entire idea of man can be made into whatever you want to be is central to the themes of writers like George Orwell and their famous book called 1984. It's at the heart of that entire book. But then there is, of course, international isolation, which is a part of Leninist life, because they were convinced that they are going to spread the revolution everywhere, and therefore most countries in the world avoided getting in contact with them because nobody wanted a communist revolution in their own territory. So therefore, when the moment it was clear that they had internationalist ideas and they had these spread ideas, they were immediately then isolated as far as global powers are concerned. Lenin had originally expected the Russian Revolution to be a prelude to the worldwide proletarian uprising. That was the reason for creating something called the Comintern. When no such international uprising happened, he had to adjust to a situation in which the Soviet Union became an isolated Marxist revolutionary state which was beset by all sorts of external enemies. A Comintern is a communist international forum formed in 1919 in Moscow to organize worldwide revolution. The Comintern took a particular interest in China, believing that it could impose itself on the young Communist Party of China, or the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. All right. Then, of course, this is all happening at the time of Lenin. So this was in fact a background to the kind of stuff that we are going to do about Stalin, who's our main leader. But do remember that as far as essay-like questions, the 15 markers are concerned, you can be asked about the evolution of the Stalinist state, in which case a background of Lenin is imperative as a part of your introduction and even your first paragraph. So please don't discount all of this thinking that, oh, I have to only study about Joseph Stalin. Not at all. You need to know about the background in which Joseph Stalin is emerging in order to write a solid introduction to your essay-like question. Stalin's emergence then as a leading contender for power in the uncertain political atmosphere that followed Lenin's death in January of 1924, a number of fortunate developments, fortunate of course for Stalin, not for the Soviet Union, but a number of fortunate developments for Stalin helped him to promote his claims. Let's look at his positions. A critical factor was that Lenin had in fact left no clear instruction as to what form of government should be adopted after him. So while he had taken the role of what in many religions would have been called a messiah, or a prophet, of that kind, he did not tell us what would happen after he leaves the world. This meant that the power was there for the taking. It was in this regard that Stalin found himself particularly well placed. That he had worked closely with Lenin and had held important administrative positions. You would remember that the Leninist state is a bureaucratic state. So therefore, the fact that Stalin had been in important administrative positions in that bureaucracy, that really played in his favor. And this put him in a position of prominence that no rival could in fact match. Here, the pragmatic way in which the Bolsheviks had first governed proved very important. Certain posts which initially had not been considered specially significant began to provide the holders with a controlling influence. Stalin's previous appointments to key posts in both government and party now proved crucial. Let us look at what all he had been earlier that was now coming of usage to him. Number one, he had been the first minister of nationalities. So immediately after the Soviet Union was born in 1917, he was the People's Commissar for Nationalities. And as an in charge of the officials in many regions and republics that made up USSR, Lenin judged that Stalin as a Georgian had a special understanding of the national minorities because he himself was coming from such a minority region called Georgia. Then he was the liaison officer between the Politburo and the Org Bureau. Stalin was a unique position to monitor both the party's policy and the party's personnel. So that was also something that was very important for him. What is the Org Bureau? The Soviet Organizational Bureau for Secretariat, which was responsible for turning the government's executive decisions into policy so that they can be put into practice. So this is an important bureaucratic channel of which he was in charge, of which Stalin was in charge. And Politburo, you do remember, it's the top level body that deals with the top 20 members. So the top 20 members, they have to tell things to the bureaucracy in order to put them into practice. Stalin is the key liaison officer for that in the year 1919, which is the year, of course, when the birthing movement is still happening for this entire setup. Then, of course, he was the head of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. He oversaw the work of all government departments in 1919. And finally, and most importantly, perhaps, because that is the position he will find himself in 1924, January of 1924, when Lenin dies, which is that he is the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He is the most important officer, executive officer, as far as the party is concerned from 1922. He recorded and conveyed party policy. This enabled him to build up dossiers on all the members of the party. Nothing of note happened that Stalin did not know about. So he started having this kind of clear detail about everyone's lives and doings within the party, outside the party, and he had absolutely legitimate, legal, technical reasons to be doing that. He was not doing that in hiding. He was not doing that, like away from the eyes of the people. Everybody knew that they had, or they were being followed by Stalin's eyes wherever they went. Of course, they knew that he was doing it for the purposes of the state. They did not know that he is going to do it and utilize all of that information for his own purpose when he is going to establish a Stalinist state. They thought that he was doing it everything in the name of the party, in the name of the Soviet Union. Stalin therefore became the indispensable link in the chain of command in the Communist Party and the Soviet government. So within the party also he is important, and within the government also he is important. He becomes this very important link and the chain between the two chains of the Soviet government and of the Communist Party. Above all, what these posts gave him was very, very greatly the power of patronage. He could decide who was going to be appointed in what place. And of course, once you appoint someone, that person is ever so after grateful to you and not to the party and not to the system. And in later stages of the growth of the Soviet Union, Stalin is going to exploit this power to its fullest, where he is going to call upon people for the favor that he had done to them in order to vote in a certain way, in order to question in a certain way. They could be mobilized in a certain way. So he is gaining a lot of power of patronage at this stage, given that he is holding such multiple powers within the party as well and within the government as well. He used this authority to place his own supporters in key positions. Since they now owed their place to him, Stalin could in fact count on their support in the voting in various committees, which made up the organization of both the party and the government. Both the party and the government have multiple committees, and there are members in those committees, and most of them seem to be very grateful for Stalin to have placed them there, because he is the person who's, the chief bureaucrat in some senses, and that is something that is very important to be kept in mind. In fact, the position of the General Secretary of the Communist Party, it is such an important position that Stalin is going to retain that position till 1953 March when he dies. He remains for his entire life, he remains the General Secretary of the party. He's not interested in being the head of the commissar, or he's not interested in being the president of the country. He's not interested in any of those titles. He's very interested in being the General Secretary of the party, because that is what actually gives him all the power through which he will rule the Soviet Union in the coming time. Such were the advantages held by Stalin during the party in fighting over the succession to Lenin that no other contender came near to matching him in his hold over the party machine. That's why he is the General Secretary, because he holds the machine of the party and he understands very clearly that the party is the government and not the government is the party. It's not the reverse equation. The equation is party is the government. Alright, so if he holds on to the party, government is going to fall by him someday or the other. Alright. Whatever the ability of the individuals or groups who opposed him, he could always outvote them or outmaneuver them. In fact, there's a map that you can, there's a diagram with which you can even easily understand this entire government structure in 1924. You can see that as far as the party is concerned and as far as the government is concerned, they all reach right up till the General Secretary Stalin, under whom is the Council of the People's Commissars, under whom is the Secretariat, and then the party, the highest body is the Politburo, and in the government, the highest body is the Council of the Commissars. And then you have the Central Committee, you have the Party Congress CPCSU, and you have the All Russia Congress of the Soviets. The Lenin enrollment, and this is something very interesting. Stalin had also gained considerably from recent changes in the structure within the Communist Party. Between 1923 and 25, the party had set out to increase the number of workers in its rank. This was known as the Lenin enrollment. So basically, you enrolled in the name of Vladimir Lenin. That's why it's this whole recruitment program, this whole enrollment program is called Lenin's enrollment, because we are all doing it in the name of the great leader Lenin. It resulted in the membership of the CPSU, which is the name of the party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, rising from 340,000 to almost doubling in 2 years to 600,000 in 1925. So between 22 and 25, the number doubles. The new members now were fully aware that many privileges which came with party membership in fact depended on their being loyal to those who had first invited them into the Bolshevik ranks. In every case, it was members of the Secretariat working directly under Stalin as General Secretary who had issued the invitations. The result was that the expansion of the party added to those growing under Stalin's patronage. So his power of patronage expands as the party expands. It provided him with a reliable body of votes in the various party committees at local and central level. What he does apart from this, and is not mentioned in your text, is that to all these members who are coming in as a part of Lenin's enrollment, he issues a very slim book, which he claims he has written. We don't know whether he wrote it, Stalin, which is called the Foundations of Leninism. For most of these new party members, these 300,000, almost 300,000 new members between 23 and 25, their first introduction to the idea of Leninism comes in the name of Joseph Stalin, because it is his slim textbook called the Foundations of Leninism through which they are getting introduced to the idea of Leninism and the great idea of Marxism. Alright, of course, the book is available in multiple translations. They must have originally been written in Russian. I'm talking about the English translation of the book. For me personally, it was a very sleep-inducing book. So on nights on which insomnia would plague me, I would go to that book and fall off to sleep very quickly. So the point I'm trying to make is that do not think of it as a interesting book that will really hold your attention. Think of it as a primer that is actually, as an introduction, as a primer that is actually doing just the job of introducing Stalin as the main propagator of the ideas of the great Lenin. That was the task of the book. That it was Comrade Stalin who understood the crux of the ideas of our great comrade Lenin. That was the task of that slim volume called the Foundations of Leninism. It was not meant to be exciting, it was not meant to be enticing, it was not meant to be enjoyable. Alright, it was just meant to be showing that it was Comrade Stalin who had introduced these 300,000 odd new people to the entire workings of the idea of the intellectual idea of Leninism. In fact, Stalin was the one person who cultivated and who conveyed a personality of being a very decently non-intellectual person. He hated it if people would, think of and call him as an intellectual. So he cultivated this personality by which he was understood as this bureaucrat, middle-level bureaucrat who's just doing his job for the party. Alright, he didn't want the tag of intellectualism, and yet he wrote that slim text introducing most people to the idea of Leninism. So in all of this then, we clearly see the stage set up. Alright, we clearly see the stage set up for a way in which Stalin will gain the moment anything happens to the chief in charge in power, which is Vladimir Lenin. And that's exactly what happens. The moment Lenin passes away in January of 1924, not only do opportunities present to him, but he is also well aware of how to exploit those opportunities in order to come to power. Obviously, none of this is going to happen immediately. It will take him years, almost 4 or 5 years, to finally have that kind of control where we can start talking about Stalinist authoritarianism, like Stalinism as a civilization. But even before that, between 1924 and 1929, there are multiple maneuvers that he's going to do which are going to put him in power. What were those maneuvers? How did he exploit them? For all of that, do stay tuned with us in the next video. Until then, thank you so much.